So here, I think we had some good variety on the poll. We have the correct answer is actually 10 or more. And some research actually puts the number at 17. So that's that can be pretty high. For question two, I think most people were between B and C. So in a 1 hour study session, our recommendation is going to be B, 7 to 10, and we'll talk about why. For question three, A is the correct answer. And this one, we'll talk about why this is right. And then the last one is about frequency and vocabulary. And the correct answer is C. So, whoops. Yeah, 75%. So if you only know 800 words in English, you can understand 75% of what is said. All right, so these are our goals for the session. And I just wanted to start off with a quotation about the importance of vocabulary. We know that it's important and that it's necessary, but sometimes we can forget that it's kind of one of the fundamental things that we're working on. And as usual, this should be an interactive session. So if you have a comment or a question, then just share it in the chat. And just to get us started, can you share in the chat one thing that you like about teaching vocabulary and maybe one challenge that you have? So what's one thing that you like about teaching vocabulary, and what's one challenge that you have or your students have?
You want it now?
Mm-hmm.
Now?
Yeah, so just go ahead and type that in the chat. So yes, share here. Yeah, it's so satisfying to be able to give a student the words they need to where they can say what they want to say. That's a really good feeling. Yes, the cultural reference, like, yeah, when you're teaching a word that's really specific or has some cultural meaning, that's so exciting and so interesting for the students. Mm-hmm. Yes, so much variety that you can have with vocabulary. You can do a lot of different things with it. Okay, great. So thanks for sharing those things. Feel free to continue sharing. And yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So first, we'll start off by talking about how we learn vocabulary. And when we talk about vocabulary, in fact, all of us have two vocabularies. We have words that we can recognize and understand, and that's our passive vocabulary. And then we have words that we can use when we're speaking or when we're writing, and that's our active vocabulary. And this is true both for our first language and for our second or additional languages. So we all have these two vocabularies, active and passive. Now, in both our first language and any additional languages we speak, our passive vocabulary is always going to be larger than our active vocabulary. Why do you think that is? There's several reasons for that. Can you share some of what you think in the chat? So why do you think passive vocabulary is larger than active vocabulary. You can think about your students, you can think about yourself, you can think in general. Mm-hmm. Great, so Valentina is talking about brain processing time. With vocabulary or with anything really, our brains don't learn it instantly. They take time to process and incorporate knowledge. Gerhardt points out that, yeah, you know many words that you don't use. Sometimes really specific vocabulary that you might recognize, but you don't have a need to use it in your regular life. Yeah, perfect. So let's think here. In order to understand a word, what do you need to know? Oops. Just the meaning, right? That's pretty much it. But what do you need to know in order to use a word? Well, you need to know the meaning, but you also need to know the form. You need to know how to say it correctly. You need to know the pronunciation, maybe the spelling. You need to know like when you should use it. Is it a formal word? Is it informal? And you also need to know the words that go around it. Sometimes, you know, in English, you might hear someone say, you know, when I was teaching English, my students might say, oh, when I give a presentation, I have to do eye contact. And I'd say, oh, no, not do eye contact. You have to make eye contact. So they need to know the words that go around it. So when we talk about active vocabulary, it's so much more than just the meaning. It's all of these other things. So we can see why our active vocabularies are smaller than the passive vocabulary. All right, and as Valentina pointed out, our brain needs time to process vocabulary and to process what we learned. That's exactly correct. And so these are some of the steps that our brain goes through as it learns vocabulary. So we start out not knowing a word, we don't know it. And then we might have a general sense of it, like, oh yeah, I remember this is a daily routine, eat breakfast, oh yeah. And then we know the word in one context, but we can't break it off and use it in other contexts. And then we get to this stage that often can be so frustrating for students, where they know the word, but they just can't recall it quickly enough to use it in conversation. And this can be a really frustrating stage. But then the next stage is where they know the word, they can use it in several different contexts, and now it's really in their active vocabulary. Mm-hmm. Yes, great. Great things coming through in the chat here. Form, function, and situation. So just to add on to that part about kind of the process of learning vocabulary, learning a word takes time. And we have this kind of initial fuzziness. Students have it when they're learning vocabulary. And often it can feel really frustrating. And the students sometimes, you know, can beat themselves up and be like, oh, I've worked so hard and I'm still not learning, like, what's wrong with me? But in reality, this is just a natural part of learning vocabulary. And often there's, you know, it's just something that you kind of have to accept and know that that means you're learning, you're still working through those steps. And then another main point here to move us along the chain from passive to active is what we call repeated exposures. And exposure just means when the students see or hear a word. So they might hear you use the word in your class. They might read it in the course book or in reading of their own. They might hear it on Target Language TV if they watch a TV show. It just means anytime they hear it. So some research says that students need to see or hear a word 17 times before they learn it, which is a lot. So that's just something to keep in mind when we set up expectations for our students and when we help them set up expectations for their own learning. And they're not going to learn a word after hearing it once or twice. That's not realistic. And then the final point here is that learning in rich contexts is really very highly valuable for students. And a lot of research is really consistent in pointing out the value of context. So all of this research, all of this science, what does this really mean for the classroom? We just want to take a few simple points here that we'll take into the rest of our session. We want to teach vocabulary in context. A lot of us already do that. We really want to have realistic expectations and help the students set up realistic expectations so that they don't get frustrated or feel discouraged. And then we want to provide lots of exposure and lots of practice. And we also want to have review activities, and we'll talk about how and how often to do that. All right. So when we talk about teaching vocabulary, here's a little preview of what we'll look at. So let me just get you to raise your hands. I'm going to ask a couple of questions here. So how many of you are familiar with high frequency word lists? Do you know what that is? Have you used it? Okay, I'm seeing a few raised hands, a few shakes, that's fine. How many words to teach at once? We'll talk about that. How about spaced repetition? Have you heard of this? Do you know what it is? You've sort of heard of it, you're not totally sure. Yeah, great. Okay, so we've got a mix, that's good. And then using the context, we know what that means. Okay, so high frequency words. Basically, this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. In every language, we have massive, massive, massive amounts of vocabulary. We see dictionaries that are like, you know, can take up entire shelves in libraries. But the number of words that we actually use in our daily conversation is much smaller. We have these high frequency words like, you know, our auxiliary verbs, our articles, our daily objects, and things like that. And the idea behind keeping high frequency words in mind is that we want to make sure that we're being efficient with what we teach students. So if we give students, if we know that we're teaching the high frequency vocabulary, our students are going to be able to understand a lot and to say a lot if they know the right vocabulary, if they know that high frequency vocabulary. So how do we do that? One way to do that is just by checking a high frequency vocabulary list. So pretty much all languages have these. They're created by linguists. You can find them by Googling. Some lists are better than others. So you might want to, you know, Google your language high frequency word list. You'll see several pop up, and just take a look and look through the first, depending on the level of your student, look through the first 1,000 or 2,000 words and see oh, does my student know these? Are there a few words on here that I should make sure my student knows? So something as a reference point. And then just as you're teaching or thinking about vocabulary and deciding like, is this a word that I should just, I'll tell my student in the meeting, but I'm not really going to focus on making sure that they learn it. Just doing kind of an internal check and thinking, is this a word we use a lot? How often do I hear it? Do I hear it on TV? Do I see it in the newspaper? Is it a high frequency word? Because you have that sense in your own language. So just kind of checking against that. And then here, a tricky one. How many words to teach in a study session or in a day? There is not a lot of conclusive research on this. What most research says is that it depends on the student, it depends on their proficiency level, and it depends on the difficulty of the words. We do have some research on memory telling us that our short-term memory can hold 7 chunks, 7 pieces of new information at once. So this is kind of a good rule of thumb for maybe a study session, like an hour's lesson. If we want to teach around 7 words, maybe 10 words, if our student is a little stronger, that's a good rule of thumb. And then you are familiar, I'm sure, with the official DLI and FSI recommendations for vocabulary. These are per day, so not per study session. You might be in class with your student for 6 hours a day here. This is their official recommendation. So we can kind of have that in our hats as well. But yeah, we don't want to overwhelm our students. And sometimes we can see when they're reaching their input limit.
What does it mean, category? Is it level? What is meant by category 1 and 2? Is it level 1 and 2?
No, that's a great question. Category 1 and 2 refer to how difficult the languages are for English speakers to learn.
Oh.
So a category 1 language is Spanish. Because if you're an English speaker, that's pretty
I believe Hebrew is 3.
Hebrew is 3, is more difficult.
It's more difficult. So there's only 5 in the top. I think it's Chinese, Japanese, Arabic
Okay.
in the top 1. And then most of them are in 3. And then just.
Thank you.
And the Russian is 4.
Russian is 4?
Yeah, Russian's also 4. Oh, is it? Or is it 3?
Russian is very difficult.
It used to be 4. I don't know, maybe there's some changes.
Oh, maybe it is. I might have forgotten.
Which one is German? Is that category 3?
I believe German is 2.
German is 2.
I'm not 100% sure, but I think but also this is coming from English speakers, how easy it is for English speakers to speak. So probably German's a little easier because the languages are, vocabulary has similarities.
Just want to make sure the Turkish is 3, right?
I'm pretty sure Turkish is 3.
I think it must be 3. It's so different from English. Great. All right. So now, spaced repetition. This is one of my favorite kind of takeaways from this session. Spaced repetition is basically just a fancy way of saying how often you should review whatever you're trying to learn. So it applies to anything, vocabulary or any subject you're studying, math or science. The basic idea behind it is exactly what Valentina pointed out earlier, is that your brain needs time to process new information. Your brain takes stuff in and then it needs some rest time to incorporate what it's learned. So here, if we look at this chart over here, I know we're language people, so charts are not my forte, but it's quite interesting. So here you can see this was an experiment, and here you can see the red line is students learned some new words, and then they reviewed immediately after class, and then you can see that they were tested a month later. And if you look at, so they reviewed immediately after, like 10 minutes later, your student goes home, does some flashcards, and then doesn't look at the words again. And after a month, they remember about 10%. But if you have a second study session the next day, so the student learns the words, then goes home and reviews, then the next day reviews, and then again doesn't touch it, after a month, they remember almost 30%, okay, better. Then we have a third session a week later. So the student learns the words, reviews the next day, but then doesn't touch it for a week. And then after a month, now they're at almost 50%. But if we have this other session here, so the student reviews right after class, then the next day, then takes a week break for those words, then takes a 3-week break and reviews the next month, then they're at 80% retention and they're remembering those words. So the research on the value of spaced repetition is in agreement that this is a technique that really works across the board with all kinds of new information. So basically what it means is that if you identify the words that you want to learn with your students and you keep a record of them somewhere, maybe it's just remembering the course book pages that they're on, or maybe you have a list that you keep in your LMS folder. And then maybe at first you review those words once a week, and then, you know, after a while, maybe you review them just once a month. But you come back every month or every 2 weeks and you do just a 10-minute review activity. Then the student is going to, those words are going to go into the student's long-term memory, and the student is going to have a much higher chance of remembering them. Yeah. Any questions here? I feel like I talked a lot. All right, so now with teaching vocabulary, you know, often in our course books, we'll have, the course book will have like a kind of contextualized, like a dialogue or a reading, and then it will have a vocabulary list. In the chat, can you share the advantages and disadvantages of both? So what's one advantage of a list? What's one disadvantage? What's an advantage of a contextualized presentation? What's a disadvantage? Yeah. Great. Someone has said that a list saves time. Definitely, lists are very efficient. And then, yeah, disadvantage is that it's pretty hard to guess the meaning from a list. Student is just guessing. Okay, great. A few more thoughts coming in. Yeah. So yeah, basically this is just the same thing as what you guys were saying. Lists are really efficient. They save time. And then also they kind of have the benefit of students can kind of look down a list and check off the ones they already know. But of course, they don't provide context. Yeah, and they might have, as someone's pointing out in the chat, they might have a definition or maybe an English translation that doesn't really capture the full meaning because it doesn't have context. So that can be a disadvantage as well. This is not necessarily to say that we should never use a list, but it is to say that if we do use a list, we should provide context ourselves for the student. And that can be as simple as us saying the word in a sentence, giving a few sentences as examples, maybe using Google Images to pull up a few pictures so the student can kind of see a bit more context, have an image to associate with it. And that can provide the context. And then of course, when we present in context, yeah, students can guess the meaning, they're more actively engaged. And then they can pick up all of these other things that we talked about, the collocations, how formal it is, etc. So whether we use a list or a reading, we want to give the students context, whether it's coming from the reading or whether we provide the context ourselves. Okay. Now we get into the part where that's a bit more interesting, I think. We're going to look at some example practice activities. But first, we'll just talk for a second about memory and language learning. These are just a few very simple points. One is that memory is definitely, often we hear, or maybe we might say ourselves like, oh, I just have a bad memory. But definitely memory is a muscle and it can absolutely be improved. That doesn't mean it's easy to improve, but it can be improved. When we give practice to help our students improve their memories, we want to be careful to avoid rote learning, just kind of shallow learning. We want to make sure that we're getting students to do something with the words. So critical thinking, a deeper kind of engagement, all of that is going to help the students remember it. And then review activities do not need to be long. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, those are, review activities can still be really effective, even with that time. All right, so now we're going to talk first about recognition. So recognition practice is for when you are working with vocabulary that students have just learned. So it's still in the passive stage. Students know the meaning, but they're not quite ready to use it yet, maybe. They don't know all of the collocations. They're still learning that. So they've just learned it. Maybe you've just taught them these words. And you want to give them some practice just to focus on the meaning. So here are 4 practice activities. We're going to go into breakout rooms in a moment. And I'm going to give you some handouts to look at with your group. And then, yes, so I'll give you one handout and you'll look at some different practice activities. And as you look at these practice activities, I just want you to answer or discuss with your group these questions here. So what kind of critical thinking do you see? What kind of language are the students going to produce? What visual support? And then for this activity, can you think of another set of vocabulary you could use it with? So let's see. So there's a handout coming through in the chat. Go ahead and download that to your computer. And then before I send you to your breakout rooms, let's just do an example together. So we're all clear on what to do. So this is one example of a recognition practice activity. So I've just taught my students some vocabulary for job responsibilities. You can see the word bank. I'm giving them a word bank up at the top. So it's write emails, attend meetings, make phone calls. This is the vocabulary we've just learned. And I want them to practice it. So I'm going to give them an exercise where they have to list. So here, I give them 3 different jobs. Maybe my student has one of these jobs and they have to make a list for each job. So let's see, first question is, does this promote critical thinking? Is it just rote learning, or does the student have to actually think about the vocabulary? What do you think? And you can unmute yourself or you can share in the chat, whichever you prefer.
What was the question, Jessica?
Sorry. Would this require students to think, or is it just rote learning? Will students have to think about the vocabulary?
They will have to think. They will have
Yeah.
to, yeah, it's not rote learning.
Because they'll have to divide it into categories, right? Yeah. And then second question, what kind of language will the students produce? Just words, phrases, or full sentences?
Depends on their level.
Well, look at how, so if I say a diplomat has to write emails.
If you ask them to create sentences, then they will create sentences. Like, for example, a diplomat has to write emails.
Right.
Yeah, but they have to be diligent repeating them.
Right. But if they say a diplomat has to write emails, what they're producing is a full sentence, right? Yeah, but are they creating that sentence, or are they just putting it together?
No, they don't create it, they just put it in together. Yeah, but you can kind of make it difficult for them, maybe more.
Well,
Like
there are
add
two
in there
things.
some other professions and then asking them to create on this example, for example.
Yeah, I see
There are
Alexander.
two things. I'm sorry. It's just when you are giving the student a diplomat has to, a teacher has to, a soldier has to, you are creating a sentence there. So what they are producing is only a word. So they are probably doing the word, they're adding that, and that's the word that comes from them as an expression. But at the same time, at the end, they're learning the whole sentence. A diplomat has to, and then automatically in the future, they are already having that sentence, and they can keep on exchanging the words, because one time it will be emails, another time will be, I don't know, shoe your laces or whatever. So you are prompting them to have a full sentence according to the situation. So
Yeah.
I don't know what is rote means. I'm sorry. It's just
No. You said it perfectly, Elizabeth. That's exactly the point I was going for, is that
okay.
even though the student maybe can't by themselves create a full sentence, if we give them what's called a sentence frame, which I'm sure you use in your classes a lot, then when they report after having done this activity, they'll be able to use a full sentence, even though they wouldn't be able to do that by themselves, maybe. And then they can do it when they talk to you, and they can do it next time. And then the other question is just what's another set of vocabulary you could use this with? So For example, you might use this with food vocabulary. You might say, in the refrigerator, I keep, and list your vocabulary. In the cabinet, I keep, and then list your vocabulary. So that's one other example. All right, so we looked at each of these. You looked at these on your handout. And we can see that there's a little sentence frame in each of these, so that if the student is still in passive knowledge, they can still produce a full sentence. They have that extra support, that extra scaffolding. And here, we'll just look at 3 examples of more productive storytelling, more productive practice activities. So this is when you have some vocabulary that you've taught, you've practiced, you've worked on a while, so your student is ready to use it, and you just want to give them some more opportunities to do so. So one is an information gap. We've looked at this before. So here, you would take one of these. So both of these are authentic resources. I got them from Google. So you might take, if you're teaching Arabic, the Healthy Palm from Saudi Arabia, and then you would send your student the Cedar Tree Food Guide from Lebanon. So kind of like a food pyramid. And then without looking at each other's handouts, so you would be on Zoom, but you wouldn't share your screen, you would describe your handout, ask questions, and try to find similarities and differences. So you might say, oh, at the bottom of the tree is a glass of water. Oh, okay, it's the same here. And exercises at the bottom, there's a picture of people running. Oh, okay, in mine, there's a picture of people biking. Okay, so that's one difference, but also a similarity. And then at the end, of course, you can show your handouts to each other. This activity is, I think, really common. I'm sure you've done this with your students before. You choose a topic, make a list of 10 or 15 words, and then with your student, you just play a guessing game. So you might say, oh, it's a thing that you write on. It's a thing that you read. It's a person who helps you find the book that you want. And this is a simple activity, but it can be also really useful to do with students because it can also teach them how to circumlocute, which is to go around the word. So if they are in a situation where they can't think of exactly what they want to say, they'll have practiced describing it or finding another way to say it. So this is fun, but it's also quite useful for students. And it can go with any topic. Okay. And then here, another pretty straightforward activity. You've probably done this before as well. You take one of your vocabulary lists. You tell the students to choose 10 words, and then they have to create a story using those words. And if they're not comfortable creating a story, you can give them a prompt, you can give them a picture, like you can say, you know, this could be the picture. Who is this girl? Why is she there? What's she going to do after this? And they have to use their 10 vocabulary words to tell a little story. And you just give them some individual time, they prepare, maybe they make some notes. You let them practice, and then they have to tell you the story, and they try to get it down to 90 seconds. So it's kind of a challenge for them.